That's a good waifu. Speaking of good waifus, today the Intel 12000 series of processors was released. First time on desktop that we've got power and efficiency cores in one design. Hopefully for the best of both worlds. It's very exciting. Can't wait to see how good they are. Unfortunately, I haven't been given one, so I'm just going to have to talk about all the old boring designs leading up to this point. Hopefully I'll still make a good video out of it. Thanks to Anandtech. The website is amazing for doing research on this sort of stuff. It's why I do all my research. Very, very handy. Speaking of very handy,
the Intel 12000 series is exciting because it's the first time in a while that Intel has done something exciting. This makes now the perfect time to recap the last 10 years of Intel processors leading up to this point, which have been the longest period of consistent naming that I have ever seen. But this is perhaps in part because it's also seen the slowest progress. This is because both AMD and Intel have made epic failures of some sort or another. Soon after Sandy Bridge came out, AMD launched their bulldozer architecture, and despite some fanboys wanting to defend it to the bitter end, the truth is that it was terrible. And until Ryzen came out in 2017, it resigned AMD processors to mobile and budget builds. Despite tweaks and optimizations over the years, Bulldozer was a major misstep that allowed Intel's progress to stagnate as they re-released similarly performing processors for similar prices, year after year, without a care for what AMD was doing. And then suddenly, after Ryzen came out, Intel started upping the cores across their lineup, and processor performance started to advance again. But in this time, Intel has also had its own problems. Processor performance has relied heavily on smaller process nodes to be able to fit more into smaller spaces, while consuming less power. But as you can see here, Intel got stuck on the 14nm process for a memeable length of time. All of their roadmaps had planned on moving to smaller nodes, yet they had to keep redesigning new architectures on 14nm, time and time again. It's quite incredible that they've managed to squeeze so much more performance out of it. But with the new 12000 series, they're finally moving on to a new process that they call Intel 7, which is more like 10nm, but all these measurements have become a bit pointless now anyway, so I guess that what they mean by their brand name is that they deem it to be competitive with AMD's 7nm process. And about time too. Before we start with the core of this spreadsheet, I'll briefly mention these coloured areas. This green bit represents the era before Sandy Bridge, and I won't be covering that because it's a mess. And it's now so old and outdated that it's irrelevant. But just so you know, Intel Core goes back as far as 2006, with products like the Core 2 Duo. These were Intel's first proper dual-core processors, with the first quad-cores coming out soon after them. This kind of processor went through numerous generations and naming schemes, but in my opinion, the modern era of Intel processors started with Sandy Bridge, which is still good enough to be usable today. Plus, these names still make relative sense by today's standards. But if you go back any time before then Intel's naming scheme turns completely alien. What should have been named the 1000 series was actually the 0 series, and you had dual-core i5s and a singular naming scheme that covered multiple different architectures and process nodes. It was a mess. This bit in red I've referred to as i9, but perhaps a better term for this category would be beyond traditional core counts, because I don't really think it was a feasible option for most people to consider this tier until the 7000 series, which was when Ryzen came out and suddenly having more than 4 cores wasn't such an insane proposition anymore. It was at this point that Intel officially rebranded these processors from being i7s to being i9s, and their appearance on the spreadsheet shifted from representing Intel's best to simply being the next tier beyond i7s as you head towards server processors. Because now we all know that Intel and AMD are both capable of consumer processors that go well beyond the normal core counts. We just don't particularly care, because every tier of processor has gained more cores in recent years, and even the lowest tier of the i9 series has been better fleshed out to be a tier of its own. I don't know, I'm just trying to explain here how my perception of the i9 lineup has shifted over time, which I believe is in part thanks to AMD, in part because stuff started better utilising more than 4 cores, and also because now I'm older and have more money than I did back then, and so the i9 lineup no longer feels so beyond my reach. But this is where things get confusing. Intel used to release these i9 tier parts a generation later than the rest of the series. So although the 3970X's name sounds like it should be based on Ivy Bridge, it's actually based on the older Sandy Bridge architecture, but with more cores. It's confusing, and since these parts are reserved for the ultra high end, I'm happy just to ignore this for the sake of simplicity, but that's why the numbers all look wrong for these parts. And this bit in blue is where Intel's cheaper processors tend to be. Below the i3 lineup is normally the Pentium series, and below that the Celeron. they tend to come with fewer cores or threads than the main i lineup does, and there is occasionally an excellent budget processor in these parts. But this video is already trying to cover enough as it is, so now I'll focus on the main lineup. We'll start with Sandy Bridge, which came out more than 10 years ago, back in 2011. This was called the 2000 series, and you'll know these already because they were amazing. So amazing in fact that they're still functional processors to this day. There was the i5-2500K, which was an excellent 4-core processor. Then the i7-2600K was 4 cores with hyperthreading, so 8 threads. Both were massively overclockable and immediately rendered everything before them obsolete by being super fast and relatively inexpensive. If you bought either of these when they first came out, then you were pretty much set until Ryzen came out in 2017, which was the next time anything exciting happened at mainstream price points. Intel had a tick-tock strategy, where generations would alternate between a tick and a tock. With a tick, they'd shrink the processors down to a smaller node. Then with a tock, they'd build a new architecture to better utilize that smaller node. Doing it in stages like this meant that there was less to go wrong, though as we all now know, it still went terribly wrong. However, the 3000 series was a successful tick, shrinking the processors down to the 22nm node. Codenamed Ivy Bridge, it was a bit faster and a bit more power efficient than Sandy Bridge was. Unfortunately, it didn't tend to overclock as well as the 2000 series had done, but then it didn't need to because it was a bit better in the first place. The 4000 series was a TOC, remaining on the 3000 series' 22nm node, but comprising of a new and improved architecture. I got the feeling at this point that Intel wasn't trying to go faster, but was instead focusing on improving laptop performance and passing those optimizations over to its desktop parts. The 4000 series was about 5 to 15% faster than the 3000 series at a reduced power consumption. The 4000 series was around for quite some time because it had a mid-generation refresh called Devil's Canyon, which came out in the form of parts like the 4790K, which was like the 4770K, but with a superior physical design to dissipate its heat better and thus to clock higher. So this was really the star of the 4000 series, coming with a greater performance leap than the 4770K had had over the 3770K. Not bad for a mid-generation refresh. The 5000 series was the lost generation. For desktops, it was out for about 3 months before the faster 6000 series came out, so it hardly even existed. But it was used in laptops, and thanks to its new 14nm process, it was extremely efficient. It was almost as fast as the 4000 series had been, but at a significantly reduced power consumption. And it came with excellent onboard graphics for the time, with resources which occasionally helped in other activities as well. So I liked the idea of these processors because they seemed clever, even if there was no point in upgrading to them if you were on an i5 or an i7 already. However, it was an exciting generation for another reason that I will be mentioning in a moment. And now we get onto the Intel 6000 series, known as Skylake. Based on 14nm again, but improved, you can see here that Skylake was, again, not a big improvement over the generation before it. But all these small improvements added up, and because it was still a bit of an improvement, and because it could clock a bit higher, it was still undisputedly Intel's fastest generation of processors to date. And just as well, because while the newer generations may have different sounding codenames, they're all based on Skylake to some degree or another. That is, until today with the 12000 series. So that means for 6 years, Intel was reliant on Skylake on 40nm to drive performance forward and to compete against AMD. And next we have the 7000 series, which was, again, more of the same. It was still 14nm, but with a plus on the end, the first of many. Its manufacturing process had been optimized, but at the end of the day, the 7000 series was virtually identical to the 6000 series, but clocked a bit higher again. So they were technically the best processors in the world, but the i5 still only had 4 cores and the i7 still only had 4 cores plus hyperthreading. And this is when AMD launched Ryzen. For its price, Ryzen would offer double the cores that Intel CPUs had, but Ryzen clocked lower than Intel and was thus a bit slower per core. How much slower? Well, Ryzen was comparable to the Intel 6800 and 6900 series, which were based on the 5000 series, which itself was a node-shrunk 4000 series with a few optimizations. So in other words, Ryzen was kind of like the Intel 4000 series. So on paper, it was 3 generations behind Intel's 7000 series, but those were 3 very small generations. It wasn't like Bulldozer, which needed full utilization of all its cores to match Intel's processors. It was more like, up against Intel's latest i7, Ryzen was 10 to 20% slower in single-threaded benchmarks, but since it had double the cores, it would absolutely crush the i7 in multi-threaded scenarios. And I guess for me, that made it a far more desirable upgrade than Intel's proposition of jumping from a 4-core processor to a faster 4-core processor, which would have been the situation you had faced had you bought a decent processor at any point in the 6 years leading up to this. If you look over to the i9 box here, you'll notice an 18-core CPU. Technically this was based on Skylake and not Kaby Lake, so I've made a mistake by putting it in line with the rest of the 7000 series, but who cares, it's all technically Skylake anyway. Anyway, 18 cores, compared with the 10 the 6000 series maxed out with. 10 to 18, that's a big leap in cores from Intel. And the reason for this is, again, AMD, who didn't just offer 8-core Ryzen processors, but also up to 16-core Threadripper parts. And for not a lot of money, which in my opinion created a new tier of processor beyond the i7, yet still delivering a performance leap that justified its price premium. So in a knee-jerk reaction to this, Intel presumably took a load of their server chips and rebranded them as consumer ones. Despite looking impressive on paper, the 7000 series of CPUs was confused and had a lot of dud products. The high-end processors were up against much cheaper Threadripper parts. You could get a 16-core Threadripper for less than the cost of a 12-core 7920X, for example. And then Intel made the strange decision of releasing the 7640X, their fastest 4-core i5 ever, but on a motherboard platform that cost more than the processor itself did. Who are they trying to appeal to here exactly? In conclusion, Intel's 7000 series was a confused barrage of dozens of products across several platforms that were released in response to AMD's Zen-based attack. It's not like Intel stopped making 18-core CPUs. There's also the 9980 and 10980, both with 18 cores each. But like I said earlier, it's almost like a new tier of processor was created with the 7000 series, for people who want more than the i7, but still aren't interested in some ridiculous 16-core behemoth that they have no hope of feeding most of the time. It's not like those parts didn't exist before, but with 6 and 8 cores suddenly becoming mainstream, the core war was in full swing and the i9 line for consumers was born. And then Intel's 8000 series changed things again. As if by magic, the Coffee Lake 8000 series was the first time in ages that Intel had upped the core counts across their mainstream lineups. The i3s went from having 2 cores with hyperthreading to 4 cores without, the i5s went from 4 to 6 cores, and the i7s went from 4 with hyperthreading to 6 with hyperthreading. Because of how they've jumped, it's hard to know for sure how much faster the 8000 series is over the 7000 series. The new i3s were like the older i5s, but the rest are weird leaps that we're not used to seeing from Intel. It seems like the 8000 series was roughly the same speed as the 7000 series in gaming, but thanks to its 50% more cores and threads, it appeared to be 50% faster in multi-core tasks. How about that? This makes the 8000 series the biggest generational leap in performance covered in this video so far. For the 9000 series, the i7 part went from being 6 cores 12 threads to being 8 cores and 8 threads, which is curious because it'll clearly be better in some ways but worse in others. So a weird sort of sideways step for the i7 line, and I wonder if this was done intentionally to make room at the top for the premium but still mainstream spec i9 9900K. With 8 cores and 16 threads, this was indeed premium for an Intel processor at the time. But I didn't see it like that, as over on AMD's side, the Ryzen 1700 and 2700 series had been sporting this many cores and threads in the mainstream for years already. To summarise, compared with the 8000 series, the 9000 series boosted higher, so performed faster, with the 9900K predictably being the fastest, normal sort of processor you could get in the world at that time. You know, it's not cheap, but at less than $500 it wasn't unreasonably expensive either, beating the identically cored and threaded, but considerably cheaper, Ryzen 2700X by a fair margin. But in doing so, the 9900K ran hot and consumed a lot of power. For the 10000 series, all tiers either got more threads, more cores, or both. At the top of the line is the 10900K, which upped the core count to 10 and the threads to 20. And all of these CPUs boosted even higher than the 9000 series had done. The underlying architecture hadn't really changed since Skylake back with the 6000 series, but by now it had been super optimized and with lots of pluses next to its name. I don't even know if I've got the right number of pluses here. Frankly, I don't care. It's how many pluses I think they deserve by this point for reusing the same stuff this many times. And what do you know? It consumed even more power than ever before, with the i9 part sipping 250 watts at full load. I think it's fair to say that the 10000 series was faster than the Ryzen 3000 series it was competing with, and I think that's what Intel cared about most, but it's a far cry from the first few generations of Core, which seemed to prioritize efficiency above all else. And finally, we reached the 11000 series, released earlier this year. On paper, it looks like a bit of a backward step. The 11900K only has 8 cores and 16 threads, compared with the 10900K's 10 cores and 20 threads. What's that about? This generation was really intended for 10 nanometers, and due to yet more complications with it, Intel had no choice but to try and get it working on 14 nanometers. It's not all bad, it does indeed improve single-core performance. And while it isn't an exciting generation for consumers, it's a big achievement for Intel to have pulled something like this off, and what they've learned from doing this may benefit them somehow in the future. I'll link to an interesting video on this done by Tech Potato if you'd like to know more. So, next up is the 12000 series, to be released today. It's exciting enough that it's based on a new improved node process, but on top of this, it's the first series of desktop processors to use a mixture of powerful and efficient cores, in a bid to improve multitasking and energy efficiency. This is something that phones have been doing for years already, yet it's still a novel concept for desktop PCs. So props to Intel for managing to do so much with a 14nm process. For everybody's sake, let's hope they don't get stuck like that again. On to the future.